Okay, if you're just starting with this particular video, I urge you to go back and look at the very first preliminary videos so that you understand what the new Regents exam is going to look like and you have some sense of what we're doing. As I pointed out in that original video, I am using the state's own outline of the curriculum, which is very bare bones, and filling in to create a set of notes for you as we go. You should be able to access those review notes for U.S. History Regents exam, as you see up here. You should have a link to that OneNote notebook, and you should be using that to create your own notes on top of it. As I talk about these and lecture from these, you should have cut and pasted this information from this notebook into a notebook you create, and then you can add notes to that, for what you need to brush up on a bit. Okay, here we go. So, Section 6 of the Regents curriculum is the rise of American power, 1890 to 1920. As you notice, that overlaps with certain things. For instance, it overlaps with industrialization. If I just pull this up here for a minute. That's happening at the same time. I often tell my students, history happens simultaneously. So just because industrialization and urbanization is the last section doesn't mean that that's not going on at the same time as the foreign policy information that we're going to be talking about now. Okay, so I'm going to focus in on the notes just a little bit as we go, and hopefully this will be helpful to you in sort of pulling all this together. Remember, on the Regents exam, you're going to have to do a few, mostly analyzing documents, but a few different ways. You'll have multiple choice on documents, so you're going to have to figure out what they're talking about. This review should be helpful to remind you of the broad outlines of that. You're also going to have to look at pairs of documents and figure out what they have reference to, and then consider issues like how reliable they are and what the relationship is. Hopefully this will also help you with that. And then finally, you will have 6 documents, all related to some larger issue in American history. It's that civic essay, a DBQ. You'll have to pull those documents together as evidence to figure out how to make a case about that. Therefore, some of what we will talk about, I will point out as part of deeper and larger issues that show up across periods of American history. You should be making notes about that in case that comes up on that DBQ. Okay, the rise of American power has to do with American foreign policy. We know from the time of George Washington, American foreign policy had been about isolation. So I throw in a note for you here, which is what you should be doing as we go, whatever you need, in terms of adding to this. You're the only one who knows your strengths. From George Washington's farewell address, we remember that speech he gave at the end of his presidency, until this period of the 1890s and 1920s, the U.S. had been, at least mostly, an isolationist country. That is, we at least said that we believed in keeping to ourselves. Now, you're smart guys. You know that's not really entirely the case, but to a great degree, the United States stayed out of the affairs of the rest of the world. In this period, however, we become a world power, increasingly expanding beyond North America, beyond what's now the continental U.S., and becoming a player in world affairs. That's the key takeaway of this period of time. So let's look at some of the specifics. So first, in the late 1800s, various strategic and economic factors led to a greater focus in foreign affairs and debates over the United States' role in the world. Okay? Students will examine factors such as economic and strategic interests that led the United States to seek foreign markets, resources and coaling stations, including interest in Hawaii. Well, what is that about? We remember, this is map of the Pacific, and I'll just pull it up just a bit here, and maybe move this over a bit. So we see, there's the United States, yeah, Canada is up here, there's Alaska, which the United States owns. We purchased it during the Civil War, but we're not really doing much up there. Now, what's the key thing? Over here is China. This is the coast of China here. You can barely see it. There is Japan. The whole world had been trying to get into the Chinese market over here. We wanted places to get raw materials for our industry, which is vastly expanding at this time. Raw materials including things like rubber. You need a lot of rubber for various industrial things. And at the time, you couldn't, artificial rubber really wasn't useful. So natural rubber comes from rubber trees. It's the sap of rubber trees, which grow naturally in Southeast Asia. So if I just move this just a little bit here. Down here, there's China. There's what's now Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia, and the Philippines. Rubber trees are big in the Philippines and then down in Southeast Asia. So the United States wants to be able to trade with China. We want to be able to sell this vast market of people American goods. We want to be able to import all sorts of fancy luxury items from China. Porcelain, right, as in China like you use in plates and dishes. Silk. Tea was kind of a thing in America again at the time. And industrial rubber and other stuff, right? So we want to export stuff to China and import stuff from China. So do the Europeans. And the United States and the European countries are all about trying to get into the Chinese markets. Well, look at the size of the Pacific Ocean. It is enormous. And the steamships of the day needed a lot of refueling and resupply. See that? That's Hawaii. A handful of little islands that are almost dead center of the Pacific. They would make a great stopping off point for ships from San Francisco, which is up right here, to Hawaii, and then you could resupply your coal, whatever, and go out to the Philippines, to Japan, to China, and then back again. At the same time, Hawaii is a set of islands that are really the tips of volcanoes, underwater volcanoes. The volcanic soil is terrific stuff. It's great for growing things, particularly sugarcane. And if we remember, even from the colonial period, sugarcane is the big moneymaker. A bunch of Europeans and Americans had moved to Hawaii over the years and bought up all of the land. They therefore controlled the whole Hawaiian economy. And when you control the economy, you control political power. They wanted to sell their sugar to the United States. But who wants to pay the import tax, the tariff, to bring it in? So they would like Hawaii to be a territory of the United States. And there were people in the U.S. who thought it would be great to have this territory of Hawaii. So the planters here, the landowners, stage a kind of political maneuver, a political coup. Nobody is executed, but they kind of take over the government, and then turn around and say, we'd like very much to be part of the United States, please. And President William McKinley says yes. Because why? It's all about that China trade. So we go back to our notes here. In the late 1800s, like the rest of the world, the U.S. was desperately interested in trade with Asia. Development of industry required things like sources of rubber, then only available in Southeast Asia and the Philippines. The U.S. also wanted new markets in which to sell its products, markets like China and Japan. To run consistent shipping across the Pacific, we needed stopping points to refuel and navigate, and Hawaii is almost exactly halfway across. In the meantime, Hawaii had been taken over by outsiders, non-native Hawaiians, Europeans and Americans, who bought up all the very rich, fertile land. Volcanic soil is great for growing sugarcane, controlling first the economy and then politics. The planters then took control of the government and asked to become a territory, not a state. They didn't have voting rights, but a territory, a possession of the United States. That meant that they could sell their sugar to the U.S. without paying import tax. So President McKinley backed the annexation. To annex something simply means to add it to your country, to take it over. So in 1898, Hawaii became a territory and remained that until we truly make it a state in 1859. Now, here's a question. Is Hawaii a colony? Frankly, we don't call it that. We don't say it is, but it kind of is. So we could say here, this is part of imperialism. The U.S. never calls itself an empire, never calls its possessions colonies, but sort of functions that way. There we go. See that? And that's how you do the notes. Imperialism, word to know. Like an empire. Okay, next item. Students will investigate the causes and effects of the Spanish-American War, evaluating Spanish, Cuban, and United States interests and actions. Alrighty, so let's just look at this. The Spanish Empire by, I should say, by 1898, is on the decline. Less and less power. The Spanish Empire is kind of done. The Spanish still own some Caribbean islands, and they own the Philippines and Guam way out in the Pacific. That's left over from the 1500s. Revolutionaries in the island of Cuba start to rebel against Spain. They'd like to be their own free country. And the U.S., urged on by sensationalistic yellow journalism newspapers, take the side of the revolutionaries. You should remember this idea of yellow journalism. So I'll just remind you of this quick. 1898, you have 27 daily newspapers in New York City alone. Newspapers were the thing of the day. Everybody read at least one a day. Many people read 2 or 3. And they were competing heavily for readers. Well, I used to be in newspaper journalism years ago, and the old saying is, if it bleeds, it leads. They want sensationalistic, emotional, angry, fearful headlines, because that's what people will, when they're walking past the newsstand, or some kid on the street corner selling papers, that's what makes people shell out the money and buy that paper. It's called yellow journalism. I hope you remember, not terribly important, because of this guy. So this character here, this is called the Yellow Kid. And the weird-looking guy with the ears here was a cartoon character. There was one of the earliest cartoons in newspapers was called Hogan's Alley, and it was all about these wacky kids in New York City immigrant neighborhood and the adventures they got into. And the guy who sort of narrated the stories, if you like, was this character, the Yellow Kid. He always wore this big, oversized kind of t-shirt. And instead of having like word bubbles, they would put whatever he was saying on his t-shirt. Okay. The t-shirt was yellow, and part of this was because they were testing out, believe it or not, color printing processes. So just because they wanted to get some color in there and try to make the printing presses, see how they would work, they colored his shirt yellow. He becomes called the Yellow Kid. Well, his a comic strip appeared in 2 competing New York newspapers at the same time, believe it or not. The New York Journal and the New York World. So the New York Journal was one, and the New York World. This is a cartoon of the time. This fellow here, people would have recognized right away as Joseph Pulitzer, the publisher of the New York World. This fellow here, people would have recognized right away as William Randolph Hearst, the publisher of the New York Journal. And because they both had the yellow kid, they dress him up in this cartoon, making fun of them as the yellow kid. And you see they're playing with these blocks like they're children, spelling out war. Why? Because to sell newspapers, these guys really went to town trying to talk the Americans into going to war with Spain, because that sells papers. So, and accuracy was not really important to them. So this is the New York Journal. This is one of the editions of the day. Spanish ships on our coast. Mysterious warships seen incoming vessels. Might be privateers, that is, pirates. They claimed that the Spanish were about to invade the coast of New Jersey. I am not kidding. Nothing like that ever happened. The Spanish never sent ships to New Jersey, but it made a good story, right? Well, to get back to our notes here, these yellow journal guys, yellow journalism guys, are pushing the war. At the same time, some Americans see it as a chance to expand America's markets again and access raw materials. These Caribbean islands, like Cuba, were great for producing sugar, fruit. Americans were middle class now because of industrialization. There was a big taste for tropical fruits and vegetables, all that kind of thing. Rubber from the Philippines, which was a Spanish possession, and so on, right? So by driving Spain out and installing U.S.-friendly governments, we could get all that. Well, in 1898, the USS Maine, a U.S. battleship, a pride of the American Navy at the time, visits Havana Harbor. We are not at war. It just goes there on a visit. While it's sitting in the harbor, it blows up. Why? Really, most probably, historians and scientists have figured out it appears to be an accidental explosion. It was a steamship, it carried a lot of coal in its hold, and coal dust can be very explosive. That's what probably really happened. But Americans mostly believe it was a sneak attack by Spain, because they're getting these kinds of headlines. Destruction of the warship Maine was the work of an enemy. $50,000 reward for whoever did it. Well, there was no evidence of it, but people bought it. So the United States goes to war. The attack on the Maine, or the quote attack, I guess I should say, on the Maine, becomes the excuse. You don't have to know all the strategy and tactics of the war. The important thing to know is the U.S. wins it pretty damn easily. It's a quick war. We win. And as a result, we get Puerto Rico, the island in the Caribbean, becomes a U.S. territory, our possession, not a state, and it remains that until now, today. Guam in the Pacific becomes a U.S. territory, not a state, and it is still that today. Cuba becomes an independent country, quotes, but this law that we put into place called the Platte Amendment requires that this independent Cuba allow the U.S. to intervene, that is, interfere in Cuba when we feel it's necessary, and Cuba has to follow the U.S.'s direction in foreign affairs. Well, how independent really is Cuba then? It's an independent country, but it is a client state, a little brother to the United States. And the Philippines becomes a U.S.-owned country, even though the U.S. has to actually put down a second rebellion by the Filipinos against the U.S. We take the Philippines from Spain, declare it free, and then govern it. And the Filipinos say, wait a second. And there's a rebellion in the Philippines that we actually have to put down. And it remains a U.S.-owned country until just after World War II. So let's look at this. As a result of this war, this is the map that you have. There's the United States, great. There's the United States, Alaska, territory at the time, not a state yet. Again, not a lot happening up there. We now own Hawaii, an American territory. Not part of the Spanish-American War, just happens to take place at the same time. What else do we have? Guam, out here. Another really good island to have if we need a stopping off point for our Asia trade. We have the Philippines, that's this here. Again, a good base if we're going to trade with China up here and Japan. This is Indonesia down here. It's a great base, and it also has lots of rubber and tropical fruits. Over here, Cuba, that's this island here, is now a dependent country on the United States, and Puerto Rico is owned by us. Spain, that's Spain, and Spain still owns a little piece of country off the tips of Africa here, a little trading post basically. That word, know it, ceded. To cede something, C-E-D-E, is to give it up. So ceded means that the Spanish gave us Guam, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and they gave up Cuba, which then becomes, again, quote, independent, but not really. And so you look at the United States now. We started off with this, and now we have this, and this, and this, and this, and this, and we are becoming a big colonial power. So the result is, the U.S. has never called it empire, never calls its territories colonies, but we effectively become an empire with colonies all over the Caribbean and in the Pacific, near Asia, that boosts the U.S. as a world power and a world economic player. Okay. Next item. Regent says students will examine debates between anti-imperialists and imperialists surrounding ratification of the Treaty of Paris, that's one that ended the Spanish-American War, and the annexation of the Philippines. So, we take a look at some of the discussion of this. This is William McKinley here. People at the time would have recognized his face right away, and it says McKinley. And there he is. What's he doing? Acting like a waiter on good old Uncle Sam, America. And there it says, Bill of Fare, which is it's a menu, right? That's what they used to call a menu. And you see a Cuba steak, Puerto Rico pig, Philippine floating islands. You may not know, floating islands used to be like a fancy dessert. And Sandwich Islands, which is an old-fashioned name for Hawaii, has the Earl of Sandwich was a British nobleman, and actually it was he invented, believe it or not, the sandwich. He used to like to play cards all the time, so while he was playing cards, he asked one of his servants to bring him a slice of beef between two slices of toast, so that he could still sit there eating, playing cards, and didn't have to get up and, use a fork and a knife. And he invented the sandwich. Well, independently of that, when the British discovered the Hawaiian Islands, which was full of Hawaiians living there, they renamed it, asking nobody, the Sandwich Islands. So anyway, there you go. And the cartoon says, well, I hardly know which to take first, says Uncle Sam, as though he's being served up the whole world to carve it up and eat it on a plate. What do you think the comment of the cartoon is? I'd say this is pretty sarcastic, as though the world is there to be carved up for him to eat. That seems to me what they're trying to say. There were people who saw this as a great opportunity for America. So this cartoon here, after all, the Philippines are only the stepping stone to China. And so the question is, why are we taking the Philippines? And there's Uncle Sam with steel rails and bridges, education and religion, consumer goods, trying to step for the Philippines to Asia. And over here, you've got, they want sewing machines and bridges, and the Chinese people are an eager market here. Oops, nope, I want this. Here we have a cartoon about this imperialism, and if I pull it up just a bit. So there's Uncle Sam, right? The schoolmaster. And there are good little American kids, Texas, California, so on. Good little white American children learning how to be good little white Americans. And here's Uncle Sam teaching little kid Cuba, little kid Puerto Rico, little kid Hawaii, little kid Philippines, how to be good American democracy types, yeah? As though he is the schoolmaster of the world for how to run a republic. Now you notice, first of all, these kids are shown in what would have been at the time how they depicted people, but they're pretty racist ways of showing these kids. So you might say, well, it's kind of a racist cartoon. I suppose in a way it is, except notice this. There's Uncle Sam teaching them, as though he can teach them how to be good democracy people, yeah? There's the Chinese Chinese Exclusion Act, 1880s, from even coming in. There's the American Indian, made to sit off in the corner and ignored. There's the African American who doesn't even get to go to school because he's just made to wash the windows. So what's the comment here, maybe? Well, United States thinks it is the world's civilizer. We're better than everybody else, and so we're going to show them what to do. And yet, if you really think about it, we treat our own people without the benefits of democracy and freedom and equal rights. So who are we? Yet, on the other hand, we've got this. There is Uncle Sam again as a soldier there, and he's going in and smashing. People would have recognized this as what they thought of as a traditional Spanish outfit. And there's America going in, kicking the Spanish around, and forcing a peace on them that forces them out of Cuba and Puerto Rico and bringing America and American freedom to these people. So, bottom line, this was a controversial thing. You had many Americans who questioned whether the U.S. should have what are effectively colonies, and whether this fits with our ideas about equality and democracy, and whether it's healthy for the U.S.'s own economy, since you're going to have businesses here that have to compete with that. There's a strong racial element here, as I said. Some Americans believe that the U.S. and white society is more civilized and even more racially advanced than the native peoples of Hawaii, the Philippines, and the Caribbean, and that we have a right and even an obligation to take them over and govern those people for them, because they need our superior abilities, so we say. Others point out that we actually fought these wars on the claim that we were fighting for democracy and freedom, and that we were freeing these people for democracy, even though we shut our own American citizen, African Americans out of political power, we shut Native Americans out of power, we exclude the Chinese immigrants, etc. Once the United States is in power, we are reluctant to give it up. Having freed the Philippines, we had to put down a rebellion by Filipinos who wanted to free the Philippines from the U.S. And eventually, in the 1950s, the Cuban Revolution, takes that long, in part is about separating from all that American power. Students will investigate expanding American influence in the Caribbean and Latin America through the creation of the Panama Canal and the Roosevelt Corollary. Okay. After the Spanish-American War, the U.S. becomes more and more a dominant force in Latin America, the Caribbean, Central, and South America. Why? We are becoming the big economic dog down there. Theodore Roosevelt, a sort of self-made hero of the Spanish-American War, he had formed his own regiment, fought in it, and become famous for having fought in the Spanish-American War, immediately became vice president. McKinley has to run for re-election. He takes Roosevelt on as his vice president. But McKinley, this is right after the war, 1901, is assassinated by this fellow Leon Czaglasz, who, you're not going to really need to know this. You could look it up. It's a fascinating story. But he was probably a mentally ill fella who blamed all of his own problems because he had been fired from his jobs and all of the problems of like America on McKinley and big business. Well, when McKinley dies, Roosevelt becomes president. And Roosevelt, you should know, is all about big stick diplomacy. Roosevelt famously says, "Speak softly, but carry a big stick." That is, negotiate and use diplomacy, but let the little countries know you have massive political power, military power, to back you up. Roosevelt encourages a province of Colombia, because Colombia doesn't want to go along with him, so he encourages this province of Colombia to break away and become the new country of Panama, and then has Panama agree to let the U.S. build a massive canal through it. What's the point of the Panama Canal? You're smart guys, you get it. To go from New York, main port on the East Coast, to San Francisco, at the time the main port on the West Coast, the only way to get there was to travel around South America. That's 12,000 miles. Our Pacific Fleet in the Navy, over here, say in Hawaii, to travel to the Atlantic, if we needed it, let's say to the Caribbean, had to go that same all the way around South America. Our ships in the Atlantic, say by the Caribbean, if we needed them out in China, had to go all the way around. The Panama Canal cuts through the middle of Panama. So this is Colombia here. This was a province of Colombia. They become the country of Panama. We build the canal through it, and all of a sudden it goes from 12,000 miles to 4,000. Cuts the time in less than half, really. And it allows us to move our Navy wherever we want it. So it instantly doubles the size of the Navy without adding a single ship, doubles its effectiveness, and cuts your travel time down, which cuts costs down and lets New York trade with China, San Francisco trade with New York, etc. Okay. So it cuts travel time from the U.S. East Coast to the West Coast and to Asia in half, or even less in some cases, doubles the power of the Navy. Roosevelt then establishes a thing called the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Remember the Monroe Doctrine? The U.S., says James Monroe in 1823, would protect newly free countries in Central and South America. The colonies that were beginning to get free in 1823 from Spain and France and Britain, they were becoming free countries. The U.S. said, we will protect them from being reconquered. And we say, the Western Hemisphere, Central and South America, are closed to new colonization by Europe. Teddy Roosevelt comes along in 1901 and adds to that. A corollary is an addition. Yeah? Plus, we will protect those same Central and South American countries from themselves. If a country is badly governed inside, the U.S. will act as a kind of world cop to intervene, that is, interfere in that country to fix it so it will remain stable and strong. So this is a famous cartoon of the day. There's Theodore Roosevelt, and you see the mustache and the glasses. People would have instantly picked up. They spotted him right away. You see the TR on his badge. And there he is with his big stick, twirling it around like the average. He's dressed, in case you don't recognize it, this is a typical policeman's uniform from 1900. Those old-fashioned helmets and stuff, right? And there he is, the world's policeman, going to tell everybody how to do their thing, keep everybody in line. This is another famous cartoon of the day. Move this up a little bit. So there's Teddy again. Oops. Again, he would have been recognized right away. There's his big stick. And there he is pulling the U.S. Navy as though it's toy boats around the whole Caribbean. Venezuela, Panama, Mexico, Cuba, Santo Domingo, as though it's an American lake. This is what Teddy is all about. Roosevelt is president. When Roosevelt leaves as president, he runs for office for his own term. At the end of that, he leaves. William Howard Taft, a fellow Republican and at the time, a friend of Roosevelt, they later break up. Taft continues Roosevelt's basic idea, but with Taft we call it, know it, dollar diplomacy. Taft absolutely uses U.S. military power to keep Latin American countries in line, but he prefers trying to make them economically dependent on the U.S. using money, bank loans, and business. By having the economic power, we have the influence to basically control them. Taft serves one term. He's followed by Woodrow Wilson, who uses moral diplomacy, as Woodrow Wilson liked to call it. Once again, Wilson absolutely uses troops in the Caribbean, sends them into Haiti, for instance, the Marine Corps. But he prefers to at least claim to make this moral diplomatic argument to influence their government for the cause of democracy. Okay, now, all of that is part of American imperialism. Now let's talk about the other phase of this rise of American power, World War I. World War I is an extremely complicated and deeply involved event, as you know. I am just going to hit a couple of highlights that specifically affect American policy and that you really need to know. Regents likes to ask about this sort of thing. Well, the United States attempted to follow its traditional policy of neutrality, kind of isolationism. At the beginning of World War I, the nation eventually became involved in the war. Wilson led the nation into war with the hope of reforming the international order through his 14 points. So, students will investigate the reasons for Wilson's shift from neutrality to involvement. Briefly, World War I breaks out in Europe in 1914. June, July, August 1914. The U.S. is not involved. The fight is between Austria-Hungary, Germany, and the Ottoman Empire. Remember that? Those are the three on one side. They are fighting Russia to the east, and France and Britain and Italy to the west. Not the U.S.'s problem. What do we care about a bunch of ancient European empires beating each other up over their own border disputes? Besides, the U.S. is full of German immigrants, and Irish immigrants, and British immigrants, and Eastern European immigrants from all over the place, and Italians. Every one of them has got taking a different side in that war. So there was no clear, like, America was all about one side or the other. The Germans, though, want to cut off all supplies to Britain and France. to try to starve them out. So they start using their submarines, U-boats. In German, a submarine is an Unterseeboot, under the sea boat. So U-boats to sink all ships going to Britain. So any cargo ship going to Britain got torpedoed, or at least they tried to. Even ones flying a U.S. flag. This is what was called unrestricted submarine warfare. And this starts to anger Americans. It's not just British ships, but it's American ships supplying Britain. It's American property. At the same time, the British cut off the Atlantic cable. So remember, you don't have radio, really effective radio across the Atlantic yet. So how do you get information from, say, Germany? Well, they cable it, right? You have these underwater Morse code cables, beginnings of telephone cables. The British literally cut off that cable from Germany. So it cuts off information from Germany, and British writers and speakers start touring the United States, making the British case for the U.S. helping Britain and the Allies. So the Americans aren't hearing much from Germany. They're hearing a lot from Britain, and all they know about Germany is the Germans keep torpedoing American ships. In 1915, the Germans torpedo a passenger ship called the Lusitania. Way you got across the Atlantic in those days, of course, is by ship. You couldn't go by air. There were no airplanes yet that were doing that, capable of doing that. Lusitania was a passenger ship, full of civilians, including American civilians. The Germans claim it's also carrying ammunition for the British, and they had published warnings in New York City newspapers saying, "We're going to torpedo the Lusitania, don't get on it." When they do torpedo it, Americans are outraged. Germans killing civilians and killing American civilians at that, who have nothing to do with the war. We're not happy, we're angry, but we're still not ready to actually enter the war. The unrestricted submarine warfare continues on and off until 1917. I should put that in. January 1917. The Germans are now afraid the United States is getting close to taking the side of Britain and entering the war. Afraid the U.S. may be doing that, the Germans secretly reach out to Mexico, trying to get Mexico to attack the U.S. from the south. Germany promises Mexico it will back Mexico's play to get back the territory it lost, that is Mexico lost, in the Mexican War of 1848. Germany thinks this will keep the U.S. busy and out of Europe. So the idea is if the Mexicans go and try to take back Texas and California, I'm not kidding, that'll have the Americans so distracted dealing with that, they'll stay out of the war. Well, even Mexico thinks that this is all complete nutjob craziness. And they rat out the Germans. They inform the United States of what Germany is saying. And the United States says, thanks, we know already. Because we had already cracked the German codes and were reading the German, we read the Zimmerman note before the Mexicans got it. When the United States public finds out about this, Wilson has no choice but to declare war on Germany. The Germans are now, there's no choice that Wilson has but to stop them from this nonsense, and the American people are outraged. Okay. The war itself, you can go study up on if you're interested. I will tell you, the Regents exam is not interested in the war itself. They're interested in how we get into it, as I just mentioned, and then what the result is. So we'll concentrate on that. They say, this is the Regents say, students will examine Wilson's goals as expressed in the 14 points, his role at the Versailles Peace Conference, and the compromises he was forced to make for approval of the League of Nations. All right, so we can be pretty simple about this, I think. Wilson proposed his famous 14 points as a plan to bring the war to an end and bring peace. The details of the 14 points, you don't have to memorize all 14 or anything. The basic sense of it is this. Wilson said we should stop the war. We should impose a fair peace on Germany. Germany lost. They should sign a peace treaty and surrender. And then we should be fair to them in helping them to rebuild a democratic country. This is also an opportunity, says Wilson, to end colonies around the world and to give every ethnic group in Europe and the Middle East its own country. One of the problems that had led to the war was the old Austro-Hungarian Empire was made up of 100 different languages and ethnic groups all packed into it. So Wilson's saying, well, why not give the Polish people Poland, and the Hungarians Hungary, and the Slovenians Slovenia, and the Czechs, the Czech Republic, which is going to become Czechoslovakia at the time. And we'll create these countries for these people so they can govern themselves. He's all about democracy. Freedom of the seas for all nations. Everybody has free access to use the waters around the world without interference from others. Open diplomacy. One of the things that led to World War I was all these secret agreements and treaties everybody had with each other that nobody knew about. And once the war started, everybody had to start jumping in. And finally, Wilson wanted a League of Nations, an international, organization to enforce international law and to make war illegal and prevent war ever again. I'll make a little note here to you, by the way. Democracy for everybody, Wilson was about, except, I should say, African Americans. Wilson was an old-fashioned Southern sympathizing racist. That's something just to note. It doesn't affect World War I exactly, but Wilson was all about making the world safe for democracy. That was his big phrase. And so part of the point of his proposals for the Treaty of Versailles was to turn everybody into a wonderful, free, democratic republic, just like the United States Declaration of Independence. Wilson had a big, fat blind spot, several of them. One of them was women. He was not a supporter of women's rights. And the other was African Americans. His family, even though he had been governor of New Jersey, he actually came from North Carolina, and his family were all Confederates, and he was honestly a pretty hardcore racist. But that didn't apply to the rest of the world, apparently. So he wanted in the Middle East, for instance, as the Ottoman Empire broke up, he wanted the Kurds and the Jordanians and the Arabians and the Lebanese, all of them to have their own countries too. Okay, well, all that sounds very wonderful and very nice and very hooray hurrah. However, Wilson gets to Versailles. The United States is becoming a big dog in world affairs, yeah? The Europeans were not used to that. Britain and France were still the big dogs in the room as far as Europe was concerned. They were the old powers, they were the vast colonial powers of the earth, and they wanted to call the shots. They also had suffered terribly in the war. We have to be honest about that. Millions of people. The United States lost over 100,000 men in that war. That was a tenth of what most of these other countries lost, and in some cases a 20th or a 50th. So it was pretty harsh, and the British and the French were really furious. They didn't want to just rebuild Germany, they wanted to punish Germany. And so they insist on extremely harsh conditions, a punishment for Germany for having, quote, caused the war. The Germans had to accept the war guilt, it was called in the treaty. Britain was the major naval power of the world. They don't want to give freedom of the seas for everybody. France and Britain had massive colonial colonies that they were colonial networks, I should say, that they didn't want to, that they were economically dependent on. They don't want to give those up. So Wilson had to make a lot of compromises in order to get them to go along with his one big dream, the League of Nations. Okay, they get that into the Treaty of Versailles. Wilson has a rough time at Versailles, I should point out. I doubt they'll bring it up, but you may have heard of the Spanish flu. It was a worldwide pandemic that made the COVID pandemic seem almost like a minor cold. It killed millions and millions and millions of people in a matter of months, all over the world. One of the people who got sick was Woodrow Wilson, right during the Versailles Peace Conference. So it didn't kill him, of course, but he was out of action at that conference. And while he was laid up in bed, as the negotiations were going on, the British and the French were doing what they wanted to do. Well, when the Treaty of Versailles comes out, Wilson did not get a lot of what he wanted. The British and French did, but the League of Nations is in there. Wilson comes back home to America with this treaty and wants to get it ratified. A treaty in the United States, as you should know, is not legal until the Senate approves it with a 2/3 vote. The House of Representatives does not have to vote on it, but the Senate does. And he brings this League of Nations to them. And the Senate fights him. Why? Here's how the League worked. Notice this. If two countries had a problem, like a border dispute, they took it to the League, and the League would figure out a solution and impose it on them. If one country got out of line and declared war on another, all the other members of the League agreed that they had to gang up on that country, like a kind of gang cops, to put that country put that country back into line, right? So that was how it was enforced. But that meant if you joined the League, you were agreeing to let the League tell you how to solve your problems, and you had to agree to let the League tell you when you went to war against a member that was out of line and when you couldn't. The senators, starring Henry Cabot Lodge, wanted the U.S. to get out of all of this, to go back to isolationism. We did the war, fine, it's over. Now we go back to being completely out of it. They also did not want to give up the U.S.'s right to govern itself. They felt like they would be turning the U.S. over to a kind of world government and taking it out of the hands of Congress. So Wilson went on this tour across the country to build support, public support for the League. But in the middle of it, he has a big stroke. He's alive, but completely incapacitated. He loses the fight. The Senate never approves the League. Wilson leaves office, his term ends, dies a few years later, and the U.S. never joins the League of Nations, which is one of the reasons why it didn't work. The result is, like it or not, the U.S. was increasingly now a world power, and equal to Britain, France, etc. by 1920. We had helped them win the war. We now had these possessions all over the world. We were clearly a big player in economics. So even though we didn't join the League, we were still an equal power in the world to Britain and France, and that was new. Note, World War I had important social, political, and economic effects on American society. The war draws millions of men into the U.S. military. We need guys to take those factory jobs to keep them going. Well, not guys. Women join the workforce for the first time in massive numbers. Okay, that's nice. Now they have some jobs, but that also means they have economic power. They're making their own money, not their husbands, not daddies. They have their own money in their pocket, and they're making their own decisions about what to spend it on. That economic power and that autonomy, self-government in the economy, has an effect on how they think. Also, African Americans are drawn massively into that workforce. This you really need to pay attention to. The Great Migration is the movement of huge numbers of African Americans from the South to cities in the North. With factories in northern cities needing workers, and African Americans of the South suffering badly under Jim Crow and sharecropper poverty, right, the old sharecropper system, many migrate north to New York, to Newark, New Jersey, Detroit, Michigan, Chicago, Illinois, Cleveland and Cincinnati in, that should be one, I think, in Ohio, just to name a few. These are the industrial cities of the North. African Americans say enough with the Jim Crow, enough with sharecropping, and they move to the cities and take these working class, middle class, factory industry jobs. There's discrimination in the North, but it's not nearly as vicious and awful as the worst of the Jim Crow South. And black neighborhoods develop. As they move in, they settle in these cities, and you get whole economies, neighborhoods with black-owned grocery stores and drugstores and restaurants for the people who are living there. In New York, you have this thing, know it, called the Harlem Renaissance. So the neighborhood of Harlem, northern Manhattan, had been largely Italian and Jewish, Eastern European Jewish immigrants. They're beginning to move out of Manhattan, out to Brooklyn and Queens and even Staten Island, which is countryside and suburb. So into that neighborhood move the African Americans who are just coming here. And in that neighborhood, you not only have an economy with restaurants and drugstores and all that, but you also have a burst of culture. Theaters open up, plays, music halls and jazz clubs. Newspapers start to be published there and magazines for the community. So Duke Ellington, Count Basie, U.B. Blake, these are some of the great jazz musicians of the day, and I'm only naming a few of any of these, right? Langston Hughes, Countee Cullen, and Zora Neale Hurston, famous writers, poets, and playwrights of the time. Josephine Baker develops a whole new style of dance. Painters and fashion designers come out of this. Okay, another topic. Out of the World War I comes the Schenck case. That's how it's pronounced. Very important to know, this one. What's the case? The U.S. institutes a draft. There were many pacifists, that is, people against all war or against all violence, or who felt that the war was really about making money for big business. They didn't like the war, they thought it was a bad thing, and they thought the draft was terrible. Okay. One of them, Charles Schenck, stands outside of the draft office handing out leaflets encouraging guys not to register for the draft. Now, refusing to register for the draft was a crime, so he's encouraging them as a protest against the war to commit a crime. He's arrested for violating the Espionage Act, for undermining the government and encouraging disloyalty and encouraging breaking the law. Schenck claims that he has a First Amendment free speech right to protest the war. That's what freedom of speech is all about, to say, I think this is terrible. The case goes to the Supreme Court, important Supreme Court case. The Supreme Court says Schenck could advocate in general that war is bad. He could rent a hall or have a political meeting and encourage pacifism if he wants. That's First Amendment. But encouraging breaking the law when there is a clear and present danger of imminent, that is, immediate lawless action, is not covered by the First Amendment. And that in wartime, what might be allowable in peacetime is not. In other words, had Schenck just rented a hall someplace and given a speech that he thought the war was bad, the Supreme Court said you're covered. But because you are standing there encouraging people at that moment to commit a crime, and your words might have an effect, that's clear and present danger of imminent lawless action, and that is not First Amendment. So during wartime, this is the big takeaway to get, guys. During wartime, constitutional rights can shrink somewhat, government power increases somewhat, and speech is free unless it presents that clear and present danger of someone about to break the law. It is very controversial, even to this day, and is still fought about in court. In other words, ever since then, the Supreme Court has had numerous cases back and forth trying to figure out where are the lines for freedom of speech in a situation like that. And we continue to fight about that. How much free speech is free? If the government is going to decide you're a clear and present danger, well, then the government can do whatever it wants. On the other hand, if you're advocating somebody to break the law, that's different from just giving a philosophical speech. So, know the Schenck case, know that idea that during wartime, constitutional rights have a tendency to shrink, government power increases. Know that phrase, clear and present danger of your words. And know that again, we still fight about the issue. Finally, here for this, students will examine the relationship between post-war recession, fear of radical xenophobia, and the Red Scare. All right. So briefly, in the wake of the war, the American economy, which had been booming due to massive buying for the war effort, suddenly stops. The economy shuts down because the war is over. And all these millions of men are suddenly being dumped into the economy as they're getting out of the army. So there's a temporary big bump in unemployment. Some Americans react in a panic and badly. They blame problems on immigrants. Xenophobia or xenophobia is fear of foreigners. That's literally what it means. It comes from two Greek words. There were radicals and revolutionaries and anarchists and even terrorists in the U.S. Yes, there were. Many of them happened to be Eastern European or Italian. Yes. But the total number of them was a tiny handful of people, and the huge, vast, overwhelming majority of Italians, Poles, Ukrainians, Albanians, Greeks, Russians were all very good people and loyal Americans. You know, a tiny percent of 1% of all of these people had even an interest in anything political. But they all got tagged and blamed for that handful. And people turned against immigrants. Ooh, the enemy. Americans begin to fear foreigners, radicals, or, quote, Reds, as they were called, and see all foreigners as potential terrorists. And besides, why should we compete with them for jobs in this tough economy? So you have this moment called the Red Scare of the 20s, which leads to the Palmer raids. The Attorney General is a guy named A. Mitchell Palmer, and he begins to round up any foreign. So if you were if you had a last name that was Italian or that was Russian or Ukrainian or Polish, and your next door neighbor said, I think this guy might be a radical for whatever reason, you know, your dog barks too much and it annoys them, or they're afraid you're going to take their job, they would drop a dime on you, as it was said, right? They would call up the police and say, I think this guy might be a radical. Palmer would get a warrant to go raid the place, round up these people, really simply because they were foreigners, and deport them as dangerous enemy aliens. Well, the Palmer raids and the Red Scare was one thing. I should also point out it leads to the creation of the FBI. The Federal Bureau of Investigation is in part created to investigate radicals in America. And in the 1920s, during this period, the government almost completely shuts down immigration. The Quota Act, the Immigration Act, the National Origins Act, these are all passed during the early 20s, and in various ways and with various sort of tricks, legal items, it finds ways to make it very difficult to almost impossible to immigrate to the United States, yeah, to shut all this down out of fear, yeah. So also notice organizations with a strong nativist edge. Nativism is anti-immigrant. We should know that from throughout American history. And I'll just fix that there, organizations, right? The American Protective Association and the Ku Klux Klan becomes a very anti-immigrant group during this period. Note that nativism that keeps coming up in American history. A good theme in U.S. history to keep in mind. Before the Civil War, the Know Nothing Party, right, the American Party, nativists, were anti-Irish and German immigrants. In the late 1800s, the nativist groups were against the Jewish and Italian immigrants largely. In the 1920s, it's against Eastern Europeans, Italians, immigrants in general. The United States always is proud of being a nation of immigrants as long as the immigrants we're talking about are our grandfathers. But if we're talking about the immigrants of today, well, Americans always feel like they're different. Yes, my great-grandfather came from Scotland or Ireland or Germany, and we're proud to be America's a nation of immigrants. Anybody can make it. But the immigrants today are different. That's we've seen that, we've heard that again and again throughout American history, and something we constantly struggle with. Okay, so we leave it there for this sixth period in U.S. history, and hopefully this is helpful to you. Against whom anyone even points a finger.